Chapter 61 The Lout of the Bostos Family. The sound of laughter echoed all through the streets of the city. The tavern had erupted into cheers as the young man and the dwarf concluded their drinking match in a spectacularly unsophisticated fashion. The once proud competitors now clung to the table for dear life, their faces pale and stomachs revolting in unison. "Ha! You dare compete with a dwarf, you lanky TW, blurg." The dwarf doubled over, unable to finish his sentence, a stream of partially digested ale escaping his lips. "Serves you right," the young man sputtered before succumbing to the same fate, vomiting so violently that the surrounding patrons erupted into a chorus of laughter. The tavern's patrons clapped and jeered as the two drinkers leaned against each other for support, their earlier bravado now reduced to groans and grumbles. The smell of stale ale, sweat, and roasted meat mingled with the earthy tang of spilled beer, creating an atmosphere as intoxicating as it was overwhelming. The dim glow of lanterns and the flicker of the hearth cast long shadows across the wooden beams and rough-hewn furniture. Adventurers, merchants, and locals alike raised their mugs in mock toasts to the two champions, who had proven themselves equally adept at drinking and failing. After some time, the young man wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and staggered to his feet, leaning heavily on the table for support. His shirtless frame glistened with sweat, and his usually confident smirk was replaced by a sheepish grin. "What are you doing?" the dwarf asked, watching as young man began unbuttoning his pants. "A loss is a loss," he declared, his voice slurred but firm. "I'm not someone who'll shy away from a bet or fail to honor it." "Oi, you noble bastard, you'll get me in trouble." The dwarf tried to intervene, but his arms were too short to reach the young man in time. "Your pops will rip my beard out if he hears about this. I only wanted to teach you a lesson, not have you streak naked through the streets." The young man laughed, the sound hearty despite his intoxication. "Nah, I'm a man of my word. Besides..." He yanked his pants down, standing proudly in his full glory. "It's not like I have anything to be ashamed of." "Ha!" The tavern exploded into whistles, cheers, and laughter as he strutted toward the door. Women giggled behind raised hands, while men clapped him on the back as he passed. "See you all later," he called out, throwing the tavern door open and stepping into the cool night air, but naked and utterly unapologetic. The streets of the Bostos March were quiet, the bustling crowds of the day replaced by a smattering of night owls and wandering drunks. Lanterns hanging from wrought iron poles cast golden circles of light on the cobblestone streets, while the shadows between them seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkness. His bare feet slapped against the cold stones as he jogged through the city, his breath visible in the crisp air. Pedestrians stopped in their tracks, their expressions a mixture of shock, amusement, and confusion as they watched the young nobleman streak past them. "Is that Lord Van Dijk?" one man whispered to his companion. "By the gods, what is he doing?" "Making a fool of himself, as always," another muttered with a chuckle. Van Dijk paid them no mind, his laughter echoing through the empty streets. The alcohol in his veins kept the cold at bay, but as the minutes passed, a sense of clarity began to return to him. He slowed to a walk, his breath coming in puffs of steam, and made his way toward a small public garden. The garden was serene, bathed in the soft silver light of the moon. Neatly trimmed hedges bordered winding paths, and clusters of flowers swayed gently in the breeze. A single bench sat beneath a sprawling oak tree, its branches bare and skeletal in the winter chill. Van Dijk plopped down onto the bench, his naked form illuminated by the moonlight. He leaned back, staring up at the stars as he sighed. "Maybe that dwarf was right," he muttered to himself. "I do need to learn when to quit." His musings were interrupted by the sound of hurried footsteps. A young woman darted into view, her thin wool coat wrapped tightly around her to ward off the cold. Her hair was disheveled, her shoes worn and mudded, but her striking azure eyes shone with a light that seemed to pierce the darkness. Van Dijk froze, his breath catching in his throat. For all her apparent poverty, there was an unassuming grace about her that left him spellbound. "What are you doing naked here?" she asked, her tone equal parts concern and disbelief. Van Dijk smirked, the roguish grin returning to his face. "Waiting for you." The woman blinked, taken aback. "I'm sorry, but I really must be going," she said, turning to leave. As she walked away, Van Dyck's heart ached with an intensity that surprised even him. He wanted to call out to her, to stop her, but his tongue felt heavy and useless. To his astonishment, the woman paused after a few steps. She turned back and approached him, her expression softening as she shrugged off her coat and draped it over his shoulders. "Keep yourself warm," she said simply. "You'll fall ill." And with that, she disappeared into the night, her figure swallowed by the shadows. Van Dyck sat there, clutching the coat to his chest as if it were a priceless treasure. Despite its tattered state, it was the warmest, most precious gift he had ever received. "She didn't even ask for anything in return," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "Who is she?" Driven by a sudden surge of determination, Van Dyck stood and wrapped the coat around his waist before setting off in the direction she had gone. But no matter how far he searched, she was nowhere to be found. Just as he was about to give up, a heavy hand clamped down on his shoulder. "Finally found you," a familiar voice growled. Van Dyck turned, only to be met with the stern, disapproving glare of his sister, Celine. "Haa," he yelped in surprise, earning himself a swift knuckle to the head. "Is that how you greet your sister? One would think you saw a monster," she snapped. "More like a gorilla," Van Dyck muttered under his breath, earning himself another whack. "You'll turn me into an idiot at this rate," he protested. "You already are one, Van Dyck," she retorted, crossing her arms. Her eyes scanned him from head to toe, taking in his disheveled appearance. "And what, pray tell, is this rag you're wearing? And why are you naked?" Van Dyck scratched the back of his head sheepishly. "It's a long story." "Save it," she said, grabbing him by the ear and dragging him along. "Father is ready to rip you in two as it is." Van Dyck cast one last glance over his shoulder, his heart still yearning for the mysterious woman. But with Celine's iron grip on his ear, he had little choice but to follow her lead. Chapter 62 10.4 Ludwig. "Where did you obtain that lantern?" Van Dyck asked, his piercing gaze locking onto Ludwig like a predator assessing its prey. "You can see it," Ludwig replied, frowning in confusion. The lantern, with its faint otherworldly glow, hung innocuously at his side. "Of course," Van Dyck said, leaning back in his chair. "It's something that has ill-fated memories with me. Something that belonged to someone I swore I'd end with my own hands one day." Ludwig hesitated. How could he explain something he barely understood himself? But ill-fated item? And someone else had it before? Was there another lantern wielder present before Ludwig? Before he could muster a reply, Van Dyck continued, his tone grave. "That lantern belonged to Necros." He steepled his fingers in a pyramid, his expression unreadable but heavy with contemplation. Ludwig felt a chill run through him. He knew Van Dyck wasn't a simple man, but this confirmed his suspicions. Van Dyck was far scarier than anything Ludwig had encountered. The way he pieced together the connection between the lantern and Necros so effortlessly unnerved him. "Regardless," Van Dyck said, breaking the tense silence, "you're mine. Be it a god, a deity, or a demon, you belong to me now. And I will achieve my goals, no matter the cost, no matter the obstacles, no matter the years. Even 700 of them," he declared. The sheer conviction in his voice left no room for doubt. Van Dyck snapped his fingers, summoning a small flame atop his index finger. The fire morphed into the shape of a bat, its black flames flickering ominously. Without so much as a ripple, it flew through the closed window, leaving behind no trace of its passage. "Follow me," Van Dyck commanded, standing abruptly. Ludwig followed reluctantly as Van Dyck opened the door to the room. But instead of the familiar stairwell leading down, Ludwig was greeted by the sight of a laboratory, a chillingly familiar one. It was the very lab where his operation had taken place. He clenched his fists as the memories of that day resurfaced. Van Dyck motioned to the table in the center of the room. "Remove that ruined dress and sit." Ludwig hesitated but complied. He stripped off his torn and blooded robes and sat on the cold surface of the table. "This slime," Van Dyck said, gesturing to the translucent layer coating Ludwig's skeletal frame, is no longer useful for you, I presume. No, Ludwig replied, glancing at his own hand. The lantern allows me to be perceived as human by those who don't know my true nature. Van Dijk raised an eyebrow at this revelation. It was new information, even for him. That Ludwig volunteered it so freely was a testament to Van Dijk's subtle manipulation. 700 years of experience made coaxing secrets from someone as easy as plucking fruit from a low-hanging branch. Though no fault of Ludwig, after all, Van Dijk was truly a monster. Don't speak of this to anyone else, Van Dijk said, his voice stern. Some things are better kept hidden, and from what I have seen, that lantern only allowed a select few to see it. Ludwig was once again amazed. The fact he could deduce something like that is already impressive. How did he do that? He extended his hand. Give me that arm of yours. Ludwig handed over his severed arm without protest. Van Dijk inspected it with a critical eye, running his fingers along the jagged edges of bone and the faint traces of slime. Satisfied, he propped the arm against Ludwig's shoulder. Funnel your mana into your detached arm as if you were casting a spell, Van Dijk instructed. Ludwig frowned. He couldn't feel the arm. It was as if it were no longer part of him. How was he supposed to cast a spell? Despite his doubts, he trusted Van Dijk and focused, attempting to summon a fireball, or even the more reckless, self-immolation. To his astonishment, he felt the mana circuits in his arm reconnect with a faint spark. You can stop now, Van Dijk said, removing his hand. Ludwig flexed his newly reattached arm, marveling at the seamless restoration. Impressive healing, Van Dijk remarked. Now, I need to see what truly happened. I don't think I skipped anything, Ludwig said cautiously. Van Dijk smirked, his crimson eyes gleaming. The same story can have different interpretations depending on the person who tells it. He extended his finger, and the black flame bat returned, perching momentarily before transforming into a small, dark marble. Van Dijk held the marble aloft and infused it with mana. The air shimmered, and scenes from the dungeon trial played out in vivid detail. Ludwig watched alongside Van Dijk as the events unfolded from multiple perspectives. The chaos, the fear, the triumphs, it was all laid bare. There is so much to scorn and criticize here, Van Dijk said, shaking his head. Your classmates were a mess, and your own actions, though brave, were reckless. Ludwig's shoulders sagged. He had expected praise but instead felt the weight of his mistakes. But, Van Dijk added, you did good. Take pride in that. I rarely praise anyone. He pointed to specific moments in the projection, narrating his assessment. Here, you recognized the flaw in the lizardman's sight and used it to your advantage. +1 point. Here, you led the group and helped them avoid detection. Plus another point. And here, Van Dijk's tone softened. You solved problems without relying on external powers. +10 points. Here, he pointed. You recognized that you were not leaving without beating the boss. +1 point. Ludwig perked up slightly, but Van Dijk wasn't finished. However, Van Dijk said, his voice growing icy, here, he pointed to the scene of Ludwig fighting the lizardman champion alone. You recklessly endangered yourself by fighting a superior enemy without a clear plan. -100 points. Ludwig winced. He had no defense for that decision. It had been pure desperation. For a necromancer wannabe, you're a failure. Chapter 63. A teacher. I didn't see any corpses, Ludwig said, his voice tinged with confusion and a lingering hint of exhaustion. Van Dijk sighed deeply, the kind of sigh that spoke of centuries of experience weighed down by the naivety of youth. The sigil of summon undead isn't limited to the corpses lying on the ground, he began, pacing slowly around the room with his hands clasped behind his back. His crimson eyes glinted under the flickering light of the lanterns in his lab. It is an ancient and dangerous craft. The sigil can harness the residual essence of anything that has died in the vicinity, even those long faded into dust. Ludwig stiffened at the explanation. He had understood necromancy to be a means of calling the dead back into service, but this was something altogether more profound, and far more horrifying. Van Dijk continued, his voice sharp, each word laced with warning. You're not guaranteed to summon a simple lizard man. You could inadvertently call forth something ancient, a being whose death left echoes so potent they've never truly faded. A banshee, perhaps. Or worse. He paused, his gaze locking onto Ludwig's, his tone dropping to a chilling whisper. A demon. Ludwig's heart skipped a beat, though he didn't have any. A bead of figurative cold sweat traced its way down his temple. Van Dijk turned away, his tone now one of restrained frustration. This is why that sigil is forbidden. It breaks not only the rules of mortal magic but the fabric of reality itself. Used recklessly, it can summon entities too mighty, too malevolent for you, or anyone, to control. He faced Ludwig once more, his expression now stern. You tried to fight alone when you had access to this power. Such foolishness is unacceptable. The rebuke stung, but Ludwig held his ground. He didn't defend himself because, deep down, he knew Van Dijk was right. The battle had been reckless. The cost would have been his life. Something he already lost twice before. Van Dijk's expression softened, just slightly, as he gestured to one of the shimmering memories still playing in the air before them. But here, this is where you gained my favor. He pointed to the scene where Ludwig refused treatment. You realized that healing spell would kill you. Ludwig nodded, his voice steady but laced with uncertainty. Yes, I thought heal spells would destroy me if I received them. Van Dijk laughed, a sound as dark and chilling as a cold wind through an ancient graveyard. It wouldn't have. He shook his head, amusement fading into explanation. The spell your classmate was using wasn't a holy spell, it was a basic heal. Healing magic is rooted in the natural regeneration of the body, applicable to both the living and the undead. Ludwig blinked in confusion. I didn't know that. Van Dijk's eyes gleamed with the light of a teacher about to impart a harsh truth. Holy heal is entirely different. It cleanses before it regenerates, removing all curses, ailments, and undead corruption. That cleansing would erase your very existence before the healing could begin. But basic heal? That would have simply restored your arm, no divine purification involved. He smirked. Still, your prudence spared you this time. For that, I'll overlook your mistake. Ludwig exhaled, unsure whether to feel relieved or embarrassed. Van Dijk, however, wasn't done. What worries me most, Van Dijk said, his tone growing sharper, is that throughout the entire ordeal, you used only one spell. One stupid spell that nearly cost you your arm. Ludwig shifted uncomfortably. That's the only spell I know, he admitted. Well, more like the only spell I learned right then and there. Van Dijk arched an eyebrow, a smirk creeping across his face. Let me get this straight. You improvised a spell on the spot? In the middle of a life-or-death battle? He shook his head, muttering to himself. If nothing else, you're bold. Ludwig's cheeks flushed, not that his skeletal features could show it. I was trying to use fireball. Van Dijk laughed heartily, the sound echoing ominously off the lab's stone walls. You're trying to run before you've learned to crawl. Fireball? A Tier 1 mage spell, and you've barely grasped the fundamentals of mana control. I read your mana control notes, Ludwig said quickly. I already finished them. Van Dijk's laughter abruptly stopped. Finished? As in, read them? Or understood them? His piercing gaze bore into Ludwig. To a decent extent, Ludwig replied, feeling less confident under Van Dijk's scrutiny. Van Dijk let out another sigh, shaking his head. So be it. Though I doubt you've fully grasped something that deep in such a short time, I'll allow you to take a few basic spellbooks. They'll give you tools better suited to your current level. I can only learn 2 spells, though, Ludwig admitted, his voice tinged with frustration. Van Dijk frowned. Why? He studied Ludwig for a moment, piecing together the puzzle. Your circle level, yes? Remember, Ludwig, you're not human. You're not bound by the same constraints they are. Ludwig hesitated, unwilling to explain his limitation of 2 spell slots. Van Dijk continued, his tone contemplative. You've probably read that mags must expand their mana pool through circles to learn more spells. And that's true, to an extent. But you forget the deeper truth. Once your understanding of a spell reaches mastery, it ceases to be a mere spell. It becomes a part of you, something innate. That's why mags read constantly, striving for deeper comprehension. You must do the same. A notification appeared before Ludwig, startling him. You have received a clue on how to remove the limitation of spell slots. Sudden quest. Spell mastery. Objective: learn 3 different spells within 1 week. Difficulty level, E. Reward, achievement, spell mastery. Ludwig's eyes widened at the implications. He'd been struggling with the decision of which spells to learn, but this was a chance to transcend that limitation. Van Dijk noticed Ludwig's distracted expression. What's wrong? Nothing, Ludwig replied quickly, a spark of determination igniting within him. He had more flexibility now, more potential than he'd thought possible. He just needed to seize it. Van Dijk smirked knowingly. Good. Now get to work. And remember, recklessness will not be tolerated. Ludwig nodded, resolve solidifying in his mind. He was ready to embrace this next challenge, whatever it might bring. Chapter 64: Breaking the Limits. Now that your body is working properly, let's get you acclimated to more spells you can learn, Van Dijk said, his voice crisp as he led Ludwig back toward his study. The winding corridors of the Black Tower felt eerily quiet, the walls lined with bookshelves that seemed to stretch endlessly toward the vaulted ceiling. Occasional whispers of mana could be felt, residual traces of ancient spells that had once been cast in this arcane haven. Ludwig followed closely, his mind spinning with questions about his newfound abilities and the enigmatic man guiding him. Van Dijk's study, as always, was a blend of chaos and methodical precision. The scent of old parchment and ink mixed with the faint tang of alchemical reagents. Various tomes were stacked in precarious towers around the room, while the centerpiece, a grand ebony desk, remained immaculately organized. Van Dijk moved with purpose, scanning the shelves and muttering to himself as he selected several books. For now, start with these, he said, handing Ludwig 5 worn volumes. The covers were unadorned, save for faint markings that suggested age and importance. They should align with your current level of understanding. Perhaps they'll also assist with your other hobby. Ludwig's curiosity was piqued as he took the books, examining them closely. Are these skill books? He asked. Van Dijk gave him a look that was equal parts disdain and amusement. No self-respecting mage would ever rely on skill books, he said, his tone sharp. Skill books are the fast food of magic, degraded spells stripped of their essence and compressed into a hollow form for the lazy and desperate. These, he tapped the stack of books with a finger, are true spells, recorded by those who understand their craft. Ludwig nodded, understanding the gravity of the gift but still caught off guard by Van Dijk's vehemence. Van Dijk continued, his voice softening slightly. If you can grasp the concepts within these tomes, you'll gain more than just spells. You'll gain insight into the art itself. However, he added, his tone turning serious, don't overfill your cup. Learn what you need, what you deem necessary, and, just as importantly, learn what you can discard when the time comes. The cryptic remark left Ludwig puzzled, but he didn't question it further. The allure of 5 potential spells was too great, and he quickly stored the books in the enchanted ring Van Dijk had given him. Go back to your dorm, Van Dijk said, returning to his desk and pulling a much older, more tattered book from a hidden drawer. If Olim inquires about your arm, tell him I fixed it. There was no need for the infirmary. Ludwig lingered for a moment, his gaze drawn to the ancient book in Van Dijk's hands. Unlike the polished volumes on the shelves, this one was frayed, its leather cover cracked and its edges weathered. Yet it seemed to emanate an almost magnetic pull. Van Dijk noticed his hesitation and shot him a sharp look. What are you still doing here? Ah, my bad, Ludwig stammered, turning on his heel and scurrying out of the room. Some time later, Ludwig returned to his dormitory, the 5 books spread out on the small, creaky desk before him. Their titles glinted faintly in the dim light. Enfeeble, galvanize, taint, flame-bringer, frenzied spirits. The lack of authorship intrigued him. Each book had a similar style of writing, as though penned by the same person. Could they be Van Dyck's personal creations? The thought sent a thrill through him. He decided to start with Enfeeble. Enfeeble, sigil. The opening pages of the tome were dense with diagrams and symbols, each meticulously annotated. The sigil was intricate, its curves and lines speaking of a dark, ancient art. Ludwig's brow furrowed as he read. In matters of curses and hexes, the most loathed are sigil curses. Enfeeble dances on the line of immoral and forbidden, creating an area of influence that saps strength and dulls abilities. Any who step within the sigil's bounds will find their power reduced, spells weakened, bodies slowed, minds dulled. It is not a permanent curse but a fleeting one, fading with time or distance from the sigil's locus. The book delved deeply into the mechanics of sigil creation, explaining the purpose behind every rune and line. It wasn't just about copying the sigil, it was about understanding its language. Ludwig found himself immersed, his mind piecing together the logic behind each stroke. 2 hours later, the sigil was seared into his memory. His fingers twitched as though tracing its outline, and the runic language felt like second nature. You have learned the spell, Enfeeble. Your mastery over the spell, Enfeeble, has grown to amateur. You have learned 2 half spells. Ludwig frowned at the notification. His spell slots were full, yet the quest from earlier suggested he could overcome this limit. For now, he resisted the urge to test Enfeeble, knowing it might draw unwanted attention. He turned to the second book, Galvanize. Galvanize. The text opened with a bold claim. All bodies have limits. Yet, with the right application of mana, those limits can be shattered, if only briefly. A Galvanize was a self-enhancement spell, pushing the body beyond its natural constraints. It detailed how mana could be channeled into muscles and nerves, forcing them to exceed their limits. The potential was enticing, enhanced speed, strength, and even cognitive function. However, the cost was steep, rapid stamina depletion and potential strain on the user's body. For someone alive, that cost might be fatal. Ludwig, however, was not alive. He read on, fascinated by the meticulous instructions. The spell demanded constant mana control, something Ludwig knew he lacked. Still, he couldn't resist imagining the possibilities. You have learned the spell, Galvanize. Surprise flickered across Ludwig's face. He had no blood or muscles, yet the system registered the spell. Was his skeletal form adaptable in ways he didn't yet understand? The thought excited him. Quest progress. 2/3 spells learned. Ludwig glanced at the remaining books. The prospect of learning even more spells spurred him on. He cracked his knuckles, or what passed for them, and prepared to delve deeper. The night was young, and the promise of power lay waiting within the pages. Chapter 65 Unlimited Power. You have learned the spell, Galvanize. Your mastery over the spell, Galvanize, has increased to amateur. You have exceeded the limit of spells you can learn. Your understanding of spells is enough to bypass the spell limit. Congratulations! You have successfully cleared the quest, Spell Mastery. You have obtained the achievement, Spell Mastery. Spell Mastery, you are no longer bound by your inherent ability to learn spells. You may learn as many spells as you can, provided you understand their basic functionality. However, the potency of each spell will depend on your wisdom. The higher your wisdom, the more powerful and faster your spell proficiency increases. Ludwig's breath caught in his chest, a chest devoid of life, yet one that still carried the weight of his ambition. His skeletal hand flexed reflexively as the notifications sank in. This changes everything, he murmured to himself. A newfound excitement bubbled in his hollow form. The system's limitations on spell learning had been a looming shadow, one that now seemed banished by his growing understanding. But the victory came with an immediate realization. I'll need more wisdom to make the most of this. And for that, I need souls. His enthusiasm dimmed momentarily. Acquiring souls wasn't easy. The dungeons like the Lizardman trial provided a rich harvest, but he couldn't rely on those regularly. Killing students, while theoretically an option, was a moral boundary he wasn't willing to cross, not to mention the paltry value of their unblooded souls. Monsters, Ludwig concluded. Monsters are my only viable path forward. With his resolve set, he turned his attention to the third book on the desk. Taint. The book's opening pages were stark, the first line written boldly in crimson ink. This is a curse. It is forbidden by the laws of Lufondel. Use it, and you may find yourself at the gallows. Ludwig's eyes scanned the page, his mind racing as he read on. Taint is a harmful curse that diminishes the resistances of its target. Physical, magical, and even infernal resistances are reduced, leaving the afflicted vulnerable to devastating attacks. Taint is particularly effective when paired with necromantic spells, such as corpse explosion. The curse spreads like a miasma upon the death of its host, potentially affecting nearby enemies in a chain reaction of devastation. The concept was enticing, a tool for whittling down defenses, ensuring maximum impact for future attacks. But the warning etched into the margins was equally daunting. This curse is dangerous, not just for its effects but for its implications. Once cast, its miasmic energy leaves a trace, a beacon that skilled mags can detect. Use it with extreme caution. Ludwig frowned, weighing the risk. The potential was undeniable, but the consequences of being discovered were severe. Necromantic spells were already forbidden, and this one screamed trouble. Still, he knew he couldn't afford to overlook it. The versatility it offered could be the edge he needed in a desperate situation. He decided to proceed, knowing full well he might regret it. The spell required an infusion of necromantic energy, something Ludwig wasn't sure he possessed or could even generate. The instructions outlined a complex chant, paired with a deliberate release of miasmic mana into the air. Ludwig practiced the chant silently, committing it to memory. You have learned the spell, Taint. A flicker of satisfaction crossed his mind, though it was tinged with uncertainty. He lacked the means to test it, yet. But the knowledge itself was a victory, and he turned to the next book. Flame Bringer. Opening the fourth book, Ludwig noticed something unusual. Book description adjusted by Necros Blessing. This line immediately caught his attention. The system had reinterpreted the spell's description, providing clarity in a way the denizens of Echos wouldn't have. The text began to shift, rearranging itself into a format Ludwig could easily digest. This is not a spell but a training method. Flamebringer allows the caster to temporarily switch their mana pool to a specialized flame pool. During this period, fire spells no longer consume mana but instead draw from the flame pool. Ludwig leaned forward, intrigued. The method seemed advantageous, but as he read further, the risks became apparent. While active, Flamebringer increases the potency of fire spells but inflicts the caster with burning flesh. This debuff amplifies fire damage dealt but simultaneously decreases the caster's resistance to heat. Furthermore, the flame pool has a strict limit. Once depleted, any remaining percentage of the pool is directly converted into damage to the caster's health. The example provided chilled him. If a caster depletes 80% of the flame pool, the remaining 20% is taken as damage to maximum health once the spell ends. This risk makes Flamebringer a double-edged sword. Ludwig whistled softly. The spell, or rather, the method, was as dangerous as it was powerful. It promised a surge of destructive potential but demanded caution and precision. This could kill me faster than my enemies, he muttered. But if used right, it could also save me. The fact that Necros Blessing had rewritten the description reassured him. The system's game-like simplifications gave him a clearer understanding of its mechanics, something the original Echos mags would never have. He decided to hold off practicing it for now. The risks were too great without a controlled environment. Frenzied Spirits. The final book seemed even older than the others, its pages yellowed and its text faded. The air around it seemed to hum faintly, as if the knowledge within was alive. Ludwig opened it carefully, his skeletal fingers tracing the lines of text. Call forth the echoes of the departed. Frenzied spirits summons a swarm of spectral entities that attack indiscriminately, feeding on the mana and vitality of anything in their vicinity. Their power scales with the number of targets present, growing more frenzied with each additional entity. However, the caster must maintain control, lest the spirits turn on them as well. The spell required a deep understanding of spiritual energy and control, a level of finesse Ludwig wasn't sure he possessed yet. The warnings were clear. Should your concentration waver, the spirits will break free, and the first target will always be the caster. The prospect of losing control sent a shiver through his bones. But the potential, a swarm of spirits feeding on an enemy's mana and health, it could turn the tide of any battle. You have learned the spell, Frenzied Spirits. Exhausted but exhilarated, Ludwig closed the final book. His mind buzzed with the new possibilities each spell offered. The night stretched on, and Ludwig knew one thing for certain. He had taken a monumental step forward in his journey. I'll need more souls, he whispered, his hands resting on the books. And soon. Chapter 66 Ludwig the Undead. Ludwig nodded to himself. Having learned all 5 spells in less than 1 day was bound to make even Van Dijk proud. Or maybe even surprised. Having finished learning the skills, Ludwig was hesitant between trying them and not to, but held from doing so. He didn't want to get pulled into more problems so soon. He then remembered the assignment Olim had given him, a report on necessity versus morality in the use of necromancy. Pulling out a notebook, he began jotting down his thoughts, drawing on his understanding of his former world. His ideas focused on the balance between morality and legality, and the concept of fighting evil with evil, subjects his homeschool teachers had drilled into him relentlessly. After all, Ludwig came from a corporate family that had certainly dirted its hands more than a few times. His father had been preparing him to take over the company one day, needing him to possess a heart strong enough to make tough decisions. Yet, he also didn't want Ludwig to become so consumed by ruthlessness that he lost his humanity entirely. It was a delicate balance his father hoped he would master. Morality is your shield, Ludwig, his father would say. Even if it's hollow, the world needs to believe in your righteousness while you do what needs to be done. The contrast wasn't lost on him. His current situation demanded the same razor-thin balance. Satisfied with his effort and writing, Ludwig raised his head up looking at the time. He realized that it was well in the morning. Today was the weekend, a day off from all the events of the academy. Seeing that he had nothing else to do for the rest of the day, Ludwig felt slightly bored. I should check on those too, he said to himself, not much out of camaraderie, but more of a need to prove his humanity and compassion, though he cared less for that. Something inside him seemed to be pushing him toward needing to socialize. Ludwig placed the books inside his ring and walked out of his dorm room, only to find a new set of clothes on his door. Looking at his right and left arm, he finally realized that his clothes had been burnt on one side and were missing an entire sleeve on the other. He quickly grabbed and donned the clothes, then proceeded into leaving the room. His destination was the infirmary. Some short time later, Ludwig arrived to the doors of the infirmary, which seemed to be open for all. The academy's infirmary buzzed with subdued activity. Rows of beds stretched along the walls, each occupied by a student recovering from injuries sustained during the dungeon trial. A faint antiseptic scent hung in the air, mingling with the muffled groans of the injured. There were a few students in it, all of them bedridden, and all of them from the last dungeon run the group had went to. Ludwig took a quick glance at the group and saw Hoyo sitting next to the resting Cassandra. "Oh, Ludwig, come, come," Hoyo said. Just as the words left his mouth, everyone in the infirmary turned their heads to look at the newcomer. Ludwig's eyes quickly scanned the area before he moved closer to the two. But the eyes of the students never left him, especially now that they all began talking to each other under their breath, probably about Ludwig. That's him, the one who fought the champion. Undead? More like insane. I heard he didn't even flinch when they tore his arm off. Ludwig felt their stares prickling at his back as he approached Hoyo and Cassandra. He leaned in slightly, his voice low. What's up with those guys? Hoyo laughed as he looked at Cassandra. He really is clueless. It's strange, isn't it? Cassandra replied with a smirk. You're either a brilliant student, brave and capable of fighting things that would wipe out half a classroom, or completely oblivious to everything happening around you. Sometimes, you're both at the same time. Ludwig had no idea what was going on truly, and his confusion lasted enough that Hoyo explained. Hoyo leaned back, folding his arms with a grin. Well, let's just say you've become the talk of the academy. Bron, on the other hand, got a massive earful from Olim. Hoyo said he had apparently managed to get the info about the next dungeon by external means, outside Olim Rembaldi's knowledge. Which makes him a cheater. Even then the academy doesn't care much about that and cares more about the fact that he took the mantle of leadership and failed miserably. The teacher shared with us some of the contents of the test. And guess what? Hoyo said. What? Ludwig asked innocently. He was slightly afraid that Olim might have exposed him. Olim already graded your and your result only. You actually got full marks for the test. A lot of students didn't like that though, especially the nobles. But who among all of us actually thought of going and fighting the boss and the mini-boss by themselves? Most of us actually hid and cowered in fear. Some even died and some captured. But you rescued captured students, led others, and helped others save their lives. In comparison, you did all that Bron should have, which further made Bron's situation more dire, Hoyo said. I guess. Ludwig said as he processed the information. I think he is still missing the point, Cassandra said. Your actions were actions that the nobles should have taken. If you didn't move, the nobles wouldn't have been blamed, and they'll push everything under the rug as the test being too difficult and the commoners have actually dragged them down. But since you acted and they didn't, none of the nobles could even find an excuse to themselves. Which, by the way, isn't that great for you, Cassandra said. Cassandra, I don't think he'll need to hear that part. Hoyo tried to quiet her down, but she was as bold as one can get. Explain, Ludwig said. I hate to use this term, but you made the nobles lose face, she said. Face? Like the skin. Ludwig looked even more confused. I mean, by acting in a way befitting of a noble, and they didn't, they were embarrassed, and embarrassed nobles are dangerous. Be careful around them, Ludwig. Ludwig sighed. More random problems seemed to come after him. Enough about that. How's your body? Ludwig asked. Just a couple of broken ribs, Cassandra said. Getting struck in the chest by that champion's tail was not fun. But once the healer comes, I should be good to go, Cassandra said as she looked at Ludwig. Speaking of which, what the hell happened to you? Hoyo jumped in. Yeah, instead of asking about others. What about you? If it was me who had lost an entire arm and had the other blown, I'd probably be dead by now. Also, that's one of the reasons that everyone is talking about you, Mr. Undead. Ludwig's heart skipped a beat, though he had no heart. Did the academy know of his nature? Stop it, Cassandra interrupted, rolling her eyes. It's a stupid nickname, don't bother with it. She said. What nickname? Ludwig asked. Hoyo coughed, proudly claiming, seeing you had sustained injuries that would make the bravest men wince and cry in pain, while not uttering a single sound of complaint or agony. The whole freshman class is calling you Ludwig the Undead, since you can't feel pain that would make the living cry. Ludwig sighed inwardly, too close for comfort. Chapter 67 The Elusive Dean. Ludwig nodded politely to Hoyo, though his mind was racing. His interactions with the academy students were few and far between, and while he wasn't particularly eager to change that, he recognized that he couldn't exist in complete isolation. The conversation drifted into a lull, but Hoyo, ever the chatterbox, seemed determined to keep things lively. What are you planning on doing this weekend? Hoyo asked, his grin wide and inviting, his enthusiasm radiating like sunlight. I don't really have anything planned, Ludwig admitted, leaning against the wall of the infirmary. Exams are right around the corner, so I figure most people are busy studying. Hoyo laughed, shaking his head. Nah, this is the last weekend before the exams. Trust me, if anyone needed to cram, they'd have started already. I'm heading to Rima. There's a festival going on. It's not something you want to miss. Rima? Ludwig asked, frowning slightly. The name didn't ring any bells. It's the closest city to the Black Tower, Hoyo explained, tilting his head. You've been here for a bit and you don't know Rima? How? I'm not from around here, Ludwig replied with a casual shrug. He wasn't about to dive into the convoluted tale of his origins with someone who'd probably laugh it off as a bad joke. Hoyo's eyes lit up with mischief. In that case, you have to come. Rima's Mage Masquerade is legendary. It's an annual event. Lights, magic, performances, rare items for sale, and food that'll ruin you for anything else. It's everything you imagine a magical festival to be. Ludwig was about to dismiss the idea, the words forming on his lips, but he hesitated. He didn't know much about this world's culture, and there was a part of him, buried deep under layers of pragmatism, that was curious. He still hadn't tested the limits of his eternal quest's restrictions, but before he could spiral into worry, a familiar notification flickered into his vision. You are allowed to leave the academy if you are planning on returning soon. Abandoning the academy entirely will result in failing the eternal quest. Well, Ludwig muttered to himself, the corners of his lips twitching upward. I guess I don't have much of an excuse not to go. What's the festival about? He asked, pretending his curiosity wasn't already piqued. It's the Mage Masquerade, Hoyo repeated, his expression softening as he leaned against the infirmary wall. A hint of nostalgia flickered in his eyes. I went there once as a kid. Back home, my family and I would. He trailed off, the wistful look on his face speaking volumes. I see, Ludwig said, his tone neutral, though he made a mental note of Hoyo's brief melancholy. Sensing Ludwig's lack of enthusiasm, Hoyo straightened up, his grin returning. They sell rare magical materials there. I mean, the kind you won't find anywhere else unless you're willing to spend a fortune. Trust me, you'll thank me later. Ludwig reached into his pockets. He pulled their insides out, showing how they were embarrassingly empty. Yeah, about that. Hoyo's eyes widened. Wait, don't tell me, you're broke. Broke doesn't even begin to describe it, Ludwig said dryly, brushing the non-existent dust from his tunic. Did you blow through your allowance already? What allowance? Hoyo's jaw dropped. You mean to tell me you've been here all this time and you didn't know about the academy stipend? They give us coins every month for food, supplies, and whatever else we need. I've been managing, Ludwig said, though the truth was, he hadn't even noticed his lack of funds. After all, he needs no food or drinks, nor does he need sleep and rest. What value does coin have for one who is dead? Cassandra, who had been quietly listening from her bed, chimed in. Wait, you didn't claim your allowance? Aren't you Van Dijk's apprentice? You're probably entitled to a larger stipend than the rest of us. Well, I haven't seen a single coin, Ludwig admitted, scratching the back of his head. Cassandra and Hoyo exchanged glances, their eyes gleaming with unspoken plans. What if we helped you claim it? Hoyo offered, his grin turning mischievous. Ludwig smirked. I won't say no, and I understand. Then let's go. Hoyo said, practically bouncing out of the infirmary. Asterisk. Hoyo led Ludwig through the labyrinthine halls of the Black Tower with practiced ease, chatting animatedly about the festival as they went. Ludwig followed, his thoughts drifting back to the first time he'd visited the dean's office, a dark, foreboding place that had left an indelible impression on him. Because this pathing was the exact same he took that time. When they arrived, Hoyo knocked twice on the heavy oak door. It swung open, revealing an office that looked nothing like Ludwig remembered. The room was warm and inviting, illuminated by an elaborate chandelier that cast a soft golden glow over polished floors and ornate furniture. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with tomes and artifacts that radiated faint magical energy. At the far end of the room, a young woman sat behind a grand desk, her glasses perched low on her nose as she scribbled notes with a quill that moved of its own accord. Her sharp eyes flicked up, locking onto them like a hawk spotting prey. What business do two freshmen have here? We're here about missing allowance funds, Hoyo said, flashing a disarming smile. The woman arched an eyebrow, her gaze shifting to Ludwig. And you look like you've seen a ghost. What's on your mind? It's nothing, Ludwig said, though his confusion must have been written all over his face. The woman narrowed her eyes. Spill it. You're either hiding something, or you're terrible at pretending otherwise. It's just. Ludwig hesitated, then gestured around the room. This office, it wasn't like this before. Maybe I walked into the wrong one. The woman's expression froze. What do you mean, wasn't like this? How exactly did it look? It was smaller, darker. The dean was here with his crow, Bulgasol. The moment he mentioned the dean, the woman stood abruptly, her chair screeching against the floor. What exactly did you do? How did you meet him? Her voice was sharp, almost frantic. I just walked in, Ludwig said, taking a step back. Tell me everything, she demanded, her voice cracking with urgency. And if you do, I'll personally double your allowance. Chapter 68 Event. Ludwig had no idea what was going on after all, and couldn't help but wonder what the hell was she even talking about. Hoyo looked at Ludwig and pitied his confusion. You really met the dean? He asked. I mean, yeah, that's what he called himself, unless I'm wrong. Ludwig said. There is no one crazy enough to call themselves the dean, and from the looks of it you're not lying, but tell me what happened, the woman said. I just got here, on my first day, and was led by his crow here, to this very office, like I said before. He stalled as he was waiting for their reactions. Spatial magic. I should have known. Ah, the woman was groaning. Now this just makes things even more annoying. He could literally be anywhere. She said, contemplating the information. The gears in her brain seemed to be spinning in overdrive. What's going on? Ludwig asked in a hushed tone. The dean isn't someone you can simply meet. He's both the administrator and at the same time a teacher. But he doesn't teach students only, even the academy staff and teachers. Among all the people of the Dark Tower Academy, he's probably the highest circle mage, and there is a rumor going around that if you find the dean, he can take you in as a student and teach you his own magic. But he hasn't been seen or heard of inside the academy for like 80 years or something now. But he does exist as he still, through his crow Bulgasol who attends major events. Hoyo explained. The woman sighed. Regardless, a promise is a promise. But tell me your name first, she said. Ludwig Heart, he said. Ludwig Heart. She began repeating the name as she scrolled down a list in front of her. Here, it says that you received your allowance 4 days ago. Well, technically it was Sebas Morgan who claimed it as your delegate. You're telling me you never received it? She asked. The frown on her face was apparent. Something didn't seem right. Ludwig shook his head. After all, he knew only one person that had Sebas in their name, and it was one of the 2 asshole necromancers that made him this way. Give me a second, she said, immediately pulling out a communication jewel. After several rings, the jewel didn't respond. Frustration grew on her face, and then she switched to a different ID. There was hesitation before she called, but she steeled herself and dialed it. The reply was almost instant. Ruby, quite a rare call, did something happen? She heard through the communication jewel. The voice was obvious to Ludwig. It was Van Dijk's. Tower Master, there seems to be some missing funds which were supposed to go to a student in this academy. And how is that related to me? Van Dijk replied. The man who received the funds was supposed to hand them over to a boy called Ludwig Heart. I see. Ludwig is indeed my personal student. Are you saying he never received them? Van Dijk seemed surprised. He is right here with me, he told me so himself, she said as she was looking at Ludwig. He wouldn't lie about something that simple. Get me on video call, Van Dijk said. Hoyo immediately took a couple of steps back. Seeing how terrified he looked, Ludwig understood that Master Van Dijk wasn't a simple persona in this academy. Besides all his weird antics, he was still someone who commanded fear and respect in equal doses. Ludwig, Van Dijk said. From Ludwig's point of view, Van Dijk's hands were gloved up and blooded, as he wore a formerly white apron that turned almost half red. Probably one of his experiments going wrong, or worse, went right. Ludwig gave a small prey for whatever unfortunate soul had to stain Van Dijk's drabs with that much red. Van Dijk spoke as he continued working on whatever was in front of him. As you can see, I'm quite busy right now. But shouldn't Sebas have handed you your allowance the first day you left for the academy? I didn't receive such, Ludwig said, shaking his head. Van Dijk sighed. Annoying. Regardless, what are you planning on doing with said allowance? I doubt that it's simple food that you're lacking. Van Dijk said, hitting the nail on the head. I was leaving for Rima with a few academy mates. Van Dijk tapped his chin a couple of times with his finger, bloodying it a bit, but he didn't seem to care. I see. It's the mage masquerade in Rima this time. Sure, go on. I also need you to bring me something from there. Ruby be a doll and give him next month's allowance in advance. I'm not currently available. I would have solved this myself. As for Sebas, I did send him on a mission yesterday. I'll deal with his lack of attention to such delicate details later. As you wish, Tower Master, but is this amount correct? She asked. What is it? Van Dijk asked. This is 1,000 golden kroner. That's a third of my salary, she frowned. Van Dijk could only smile as he cut off the call. You really have a good master, not to mention this is just your expense as a freshman. Next year starts you'd probably be paid the same as I do. She sighed as she signed some papers and pulled a small pouch from under the drawer. She did a quick count and handed the pouch to Ludwig. This should take care of the expenses of this month. And I also added something there for the hint about the dean. Regardless, don't waste it all on random things. You won't be getting anything from me next month, she said as she dismissed the two. Hoyo's grin was wide enough that it reached his ears. We're rich, he said. I'm rich, Ludwig replied. Once he saw Hoyo's expression sour, he added after a laugh. But I'll never let the homies suffer. Let's see what this mage masquerade event is all about. Chapter 69. Nice. The two soon returned to the infirmary, finding Cassandra seated on the edge of her bed, her expression a mixture of annoyance and relief as a staff member handed her a discharge note. Her hair, still faintly matted with traces of mud, betrayed her recent trials. How are you feeling? Ludwig asked. Like the dead, Cassandra quipped, though a smirk tugged at her lips. Everything hurts, but I've had worse. So, when are you two leaving for Rima? We were about to head there now, Hoyo said, nudging Ludwig playfully. But this guy said we should wait for you. Me? Why? Cassandra raised an eyebrow, her tone skeptical. Ludwig shrugged. You looked like you wanted to go earlier. Cassandra blinked, caught off guard. She hesitated, but before she could continue, Hoyo jumped in. Have you ever been to a mage masquerade before? Not really, she admitted, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. I've heard about them, though. Their caravan moves all over the country. People talk about how amazing they are. Magic shows, enchanted goods, even fortune tellers. And then there's the rule about masks. You can't enter without one. Exactly, Hoyo said, grinning. That's the beauty of it. Nobles and commoners mingling together without all the usual societal garbage getting in the way. No status, no titles, just people enjoying themselves. And if someone tries to pull rank, they're banned for life. It's one of the few places where the rules are actually fair. Sounds like a fun place, Ludwig mused. But how far is Rima from here? We don't exactly have carriages waiting for us. Just follow me, Hoyo said with an air of confidence. We'll get there in less than 5 minutes. Ludwig frowned. Nothing near the academy was that close, not even the Black Tower, which was nearly an hour's walk. But he decided to keep his concerns to himself for now and followed Hoyo. Cassandra, meanwhile, grimaced and glanced at her reflection in the infirmary window. Can you guys do me a favor? Head out without me for now. I need to clean up first. I think I still have mud in my hair from the dungeon, and they didn't let me return to the dorms after we got back. Sure, Hoyo said with a resigned sigh. We'll wait for you at the last adventure inn. Don't take too long, though. I'll be there in an hour, Cassandra promised, already heading toward the infirmary's small washroom. Hoyo groaned the moment she was out of earshot. An hour? More like 4. You realize this, right? It's just an hour, Ludwig said, shrugging off Hoyo's theatrics. Oh, Ludwig, Hoyo said, clapping a hand on his shoulder. You sweet, naive soul. When a girl says an hour, what she means is I'll show up eventually. He laughed, leading Ludwig toward the central building of the academy. ****. The central building's first floor was abuzz with activity, a steady flow of students streaming through a massive arched doorway that pulsed faintly with magic. Ludwig noticed most of them moved in pairs or small groups, their chatter filling the air with excitement. As they stepped through the doorway, Ludwig's breath hitched. The chamber beyond was enormous, easily the size of the academy's entire dining hall. 12 grand portals, each radiating distinct magical auras, stood arranged in a circle around a central orb of shimmering light. The orb pulsed rhythmically, sending waves of energy rippling through the air. Runes and glyphs swirled around the orb, shifting and rotating in intricate patterns that seemed to defy logic. Ludwig found himself drawn to the spectacle, his eyes tracing the arcane symbols as they flowed seamlessly into one another. You have witnessed the intricacies of spatial magic, a true testament to mastery. +1 wisdom. Hoyo nudged him with an elbow, snapping him out of his trance. You good there, buddy? It's quite incredible, Ludwig said, his voice barely above a whisper. First time seeing a teleportation hub, a staff member asked as the two approached. The man was middle-aged, his robes neatly pressed, though his expression betrayed a hint of boredom. Yeah, Ludwig admitted. The staff member chuckled. Names and destination. Hoyo Drac and Ludwig Heart, Hoyo said confidently. We're heading to Rima. Ah, the mage masquerade, the man said, his demeanor brightening. A fine choice. Not many students are heading there this year. Most of the nobles are returning to their estates for the weekend. Good riddance, Hoyo muttered under his breath, earning a laugh from the staff member. Gate number 7, the man said, pointing to a glowing portal on the far side of the chamber. Enjoy the festival. The two walked through the gate, and in an instant, the world around Ludwig shifted. ****. Ludwig stumbled slightly as they emerged into a sunlit city square. The contrast to the dark, somber halls of the academy was staggering. The square was alive with energy, vendors shouting their wares, children darting between stalls, and a cacophony of smells wafting through the air. Spices, roasted meats, and sweet confections mingled into an intoxicating aroma that made Ludwig's stomach rumble. The buildings surrounding the square were a mix of stone and timber, their brightly painted facades adorned with banners and lanterns. Magic was everywhere. Floating candles lit the pathways, illusionary creatures danced above the crowds, and enchanted instruments played lively tunes without visible musicians. Welcome to Rima, Hoyo said, throwing his arms wide. The heart of life outside the academy. Take it all in. Ludwig's eyes darted from one spectacle to another. A fire breather exhaled a plume of green flames, earning cheers from a gathered crowd. At another stall, a vendor sold shimmering crystals that changed color when held. A pair of short-statured, definitely not human men with long beards and burly muscles argued good-naturedly over the price of a potion, their voices rising above the din. It's overwhelming, Ludwig admitted. Hoyo laughed. Give it a minute. You'll get used to it. As they moved deeper into the square, Ludwig couldn't shake the feeling that this city held more secrets than it let on. Rima was alive, vibrant, and utterly captivating. He allowed himself to be swept up in the moment, following Hoyo as they made their way toward the Last Adventure Inn. Chapter 70, The Last Adventure Inn. You look quite surprised, Hoyo said. Ludwig's eyes were looking at a girl who was moving ahead of 3 other men who wore hoods that covered their entire bodies but their faces. The girl seemed to be about the age of Ludwig, and had an incredibly beautiful face. A sharp jawline to match and green as emerald eyes. Her hair was a mix of gold and silver, and her hood seemed to have slightly fallen enough that her ear was visible to Ludwig to see. The ears was long and pointy, and this brought memories of stories and novels that Ludwig had grown up reading. Yeah, also, is that an elf? Ludwig asked. As if the world went silent, The people around Ludwig and Hoyo's horrified expression was enough of a tell to Ludwig that something bad just happened. "He's just joking. Ha ha." Hoyo said, stifling an awkward expression and laugh. "He's here for the first time. Don't mind him, he doesn't know anything," he said as he patted Ludwig on the back. The group of people that paid attention to Ludwig soon began losing interest and the rowdiness of the square returned to how it was. However, "You're in a hostile environment." Ludwig noticed that one of the three men placed his palm on the pommel of his sword, perhaps out of habit, but another person soon lightly nudged him, stopping any and all aggression. "You really are clueless," Hoyo said as he led Ludwig out of the square. "Why? What's up with elves?" Ludwig said. "First off, there is no way there is an elf in this empire. Lufondel is extremely hostile to them," Hoyo said. Ludwig frowned as he turned his head to once again look at the elven group. The girl who Ludwig was talking about had locked gaze with Ludwig's eyes. Second, if there was an elf here, all hell would break loose. The country's imperial knights would come rushing here and literally kill any and all that are associated with elves, even if they simply look at them. Last, if there was truly an elf there, we'd all be dead by now, Hoyo said as he dragged Ludwig all the way to a nearby inn. Out of curiosity, before Ludwig's eyes could no longer see the girl as the crowd was getting bigger. "Inspect," he muttered. Status screen. Name, Larina Ules. Race, High Elf. Title, Tragic Princess. Level, HP. Currently under the status effect, Light Spirit's Blessing. The spirits of light are bending light around the bearer of this blessing, changing the perspective of those who look at them. Necro's blessing is neutralizing this minor effect. Ludwig knew it. There were elves in this world, and his eyes didn't lie to him. This was the same that happened with the succubus teacher Simoria Asmiralis. What did the elves do for the relationship between Lufondel and them to be this bad? Ludwig asked. What didn't they do, Hoyo said, besides the fact that they planned a full-on rebellion against the former emperor, killed 2 of the royal princes of the last generations, basically the uncles of the current emperor, created havoc through the land, arson, murder, rape, kidnappings, and more. They're a hostile race that even the spirits don't want to associate with them. They're a race comparable to demons. Even halflings are considered utter and complete dregs of society because they share similarities with elves. Something caught Ludwig's attention in Hoyo's words. That the spirits wouldn't want to associate with elves. But didn't that girl have the blessing of a light spirit? Ludwig moved alongside Hoyo until they an inn. It looked like a simple inn where adventurers gathered in and around. Several people moved about, carrying their weapons in the forms of swords strapped to their belts and armor donned down, while others had bows and spears nearby. Though even with all these weapons visible in broad daylight, there was no sign of any form of hostility or aggressiveness from the people here. There was an amicable air of venture and passion visible on the faces of everyone near the inn. The plank on top of the door displayed the inn's name in a fashionable and quite interesting way. The name Last Adventure was written in bold letters, and next to it was a mug of ale with a skull sitting right next to it, where some cobwebs seemed to cover parts of it. Truly fitting the name of Last Adventure, Ludwig muttered. Yeah, this is a place famed for serving adventurers who have quite the job or on the fences. It's actually the best place for newer adventurers to come in and learn the craft from olden veterans. And they're very friendly toward the 5 towers. All 5? Ludwig asked. You'll see, Hoyo said as the 2 of them entered the inn. The inside was massively different compared to the outside simple look, as there were dozens of tables all over the place where several adventurers were chatting with each other. Some displayed their muscles boldly and flexed them to flex on other adventurers and garner some appeal of laughing female adventurers, while other tables had an eerie calm to them, as the people who were sitting there seemed to want to drink their ale without uttering a word. The air around those people was slightly suffocating as they seemed to be worn and torn adventurers, either missing limbs from old battles or scarred and burned beyond what's humanly tolerable. Yet they still couldn't lower the ambience of the inn itself. Ludwig's eyes scanned the crowd until it landed on a group of people roughly their age sitting at a corner. The people were wearing similar clothes to Ludwig and Hoyo. The only difference was that their clothes were white in color. Damn! I didn't want to meet those guys this early, Hoyo groaned. just as Ludwig was about to ask Hoyo on why he was so annoyed with meeting other people. "Ah, the crows are here. No wonder the beer tastes like shit." The voice of a rude and arrogant-looking brat sounded from their table. "It's the White Tower Academy." Hoyo muttered for Ludwig's ears only.